Under a blazing afternoon sun, a question echoed through the mountain air. What would make a man carry another man's child up a mountain he couldn't climb himself? The cameras caught it by accident. A tourist's drone hovering over the Blue Ridge Trail that morning captured a lone figure, his back bent beneath the weight of a teenage boy whose legs hung motionless. The man trudged up the path, sweat glistening on his neck, each step deliberate, unyielding. Behind him, hikers paused, some moved to tears, others silently filming. They didn't know who he was. They didn't know who the boy was either. But within hours, the video would cross 100 million views and reach a man who would stop a meeting mid-sentence, stand from a table surrounded by billionaires and whisper, "That's my son." The man was Victor Hale, a name printed on skyscrapers, luxury jets, and headlines. To the world, he was the man who built empires from ashes, who turned bankrupt companies into billion-dollar monsters. But to his son, Ethan, he was mostly a voice through a phone speaker, filtered by time zones and corporate deadlines. Ethan was 16, confined to a wheelchair since birth, his legs never strong enough to walk unaided. Every summer, he'd ask his father to take him up the Blue Ridge Trail. Just once. "Dad, I want to see the sunrise from the top." Every year, Victor promised, and every year, something more urgent came up. The man in the video wasn't Victor. He was a stranger. In the footage, the stranger's face was streaked with dirt, but his eyes were focused, a kind of quiet determination that belonged to people who had nothing to prove, but everything to give. He wore no hiking gear, no brand logos, just an old gray shirt and boots with cracked soles. As he neared the summit, the wind picked up, sweeping Ethan's hair across his face. The boy's laughter echoed faintly through the trees, carried upward with the sound of rustling leaves. It was raw, free, the laughter of someone tasting life at its purest. When the clip went viral, the world turned it into inspiration. "Humanity still exists," the captions read. But for Victor, it wasn't a story, it was a reckoning. 2 days later, a black limousine rolled through a small North Carolina town. It didn't belong there. It didn't belong anywhere that smelled of pine and earth. Victor stepped out in a tailored suit that looked absurd against the dusty trailhead. His security detail waited behind as he stared at the photo on his phone. The man and his son, frozen mid-ascent, the boy's face bright with joy. He was there to find the man who had carried his son. Locals recognized Victor instantly, though no one dared approach. The owner of a roadside diner pointed him toward a small cabin near the edge of the woods. "Name's Jack," she said softly. "Used to work construction till his back gave out. Keeps to himself mostly. Good man." Victor followed the directions, the gravel crunching beneath his shoes. He expected something dramatic, perhaps gratitude, perhaps confrontation. But as the cabin came into view, something else gripped him. Silence. The kind of silence that felt earned, not empty. Jack was out front, splitting wood. He didn't look up when Victor's car pulled in. He didn't need to. He'd seen the black sedan on the news, parked outside boardrooms and fundraisers. He knew who it was before a word was spoken. "You're the man who carried my son," Victor said quietly. Jack drove the axe into the block of wood and straightened slowly, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. "Didn't know he was yours," he replied. "Didn't matter." The air between them hung heavy. Victor's mind raced with questions. Why did you do it? What did he tell you? What did I miss? But what came out instead was something far smaller, almost fragile. "Thank you," Jack nodded once. "You don't need to thank me. Kid just wanted to see the world from the top." He looked toward the ridge, his eyes narrowing at the memory. Said no one ever took him there before. The words hit harder than any accusation. Victor turned away, pretending to study the landscape, but his chest felt tight. He imagined Ethan on that mountain, laughing, alive, seeing beauty his father had never made time for. For the first time in years, Victor realized he couldn't buy his way into that memory. He could build skyscrapers, sure, but not moments like that. They stood in silence for a long time. The wind moved through the trees, whispering like something ancient. Finally, Jack broke it. "He told me you were busy," said he understood. Victor's throat closed. The apology that wanted to come out wouldn't form. He shouldn't have had to, Jack shrugged. "Maybe, but the boy doesn't blame you." He looked at Victor then, really looked, at the crisp suit, the polished shoes, the exhaustion beneath the surface. You know, up there on that trail, he talked about you the whole time. Said you were his hero. Said one day you'd take him yourself. Victor's jaw tightened. He said that? Every step. It was a strange kind of pain, not sharp, not sudden, but deep and spreading like frost. He'd spent years chasing success so his son could have everything, and yet here stood a man with nothing who'd given Ethan something priceless. Victor's phone buzzed. He ignored it. After a while, he asked, "Why'd you do it?" "You didn't know him." Jack hesitated. "Because once someone carried me." He said it simply, as if that explained everything. But his eyes gave away a weight behind the words, something unspoken. Victor wanted to ask more, but he didn't. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a check. "Please," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "let me do something for you." Jack stared at the paper, the ink still drying. The amount could have changed his life. He didn't take it. "You already did," he said. "You raised a good boy." Victor felt the words land like a confession he didn't deserve. That night, as the billionaire drove back to his hotel, the road winding through shadows and moonlight, he couldn't shake the image of Jack, the man who carried his son when he couldn't even show up. For the first time in years, Victor didn't feel powerful. He felt small, humbled, human. He returned home the next morning. Ethan was waiting in his chair by the window, watching the sunrise over the city skyline. When Victor entered, the boy's face lit up. "Dad, did you see the video?" Ethan grinned. "That guy Jack, he's amazing, right?" Victor knelt beside him, his eyes soft but heavy with something unspoken. "I saw it. You know what he told me up there?" Ethan said, excitement bubbling in his voice. "He said one day I'd walk that trail myself. He said he believed I could." Victor swallowed hard. He was right. For a moment, they just sat in silence, sunlight spilling across the floor, painting gold on everything it touched. Then Ethan looked at his father with quiet hope. "Do you think maybe next time you could come with me?" Victor's lips parted, but the answer didn't come. He thought of the endless boardrooms, the investors waiting, the empire that never stopped demanding more. He thought of Jack's cabin, the simplicity, the peace. Finally, he said, "Next time, I'll carry you myself." But promises, as Victor had learned, are fragile things, easier spoken than kept. Because a week later, before he could make good on his words, something unexpected happened. Jack disappeared. No one saw him leave the cabin. The axe still sat by the chopping block, wood half split. His truck was there. His phone was not. And when Victor received a letter in the mail with no return, address Carl, a letter in handwriting he recognized, from the signature on a hospital consent form years ago, he realized he didn't know the half of who Jack really was. The envelope contained only one line written in ink that bled faintly through the paper. "You don't remember me, Victor, but I remember the day you walked away." And for the first time since the mountain, the billionaire felt a chill run through his veins, colder than regret, sharper than fear, because he suddenly understood the man who carried his son might have once carried something far heavier. Something that tied their past together in ways neither of them had ever spoken of. Some debts, it seemed, weren't paid in money. They were paid in moments, and in the truths that refused to stay buried. Victor stared at the letter for a long time, the paper trembling slightly between his fingers. The ink had bled just enough to blur the final word. "Away." It wasn't typed. It was written by hand, Jack's handwriting. And yet it wasn't the words that unsettled him most. It was the familiarity of them. He'd heard that phrase before, years ago, on another letter, one he'd chosen to ignore. Outside his office window, the skyline glowed in the early evening haze. The city below hummed with traffic and ambition, two things Victor had built his life around. But now that world felt hollow, a glass tower built on silence and guilt. He laid the letter flat on his desk, staring at it like it might start speaking if he looked long enough. "You don't remember me, Victor." But he did remember someone. Flashes of the past came in fragments. A construction site 20 years ago. A young man with a chipped smile and calloused hands, always laughing even when the work was brutal. He was one of Victor's first employees when Hale Industries was still just a handful of men, patching together steel and hope. The man's name. It couldn't be. Jack. Victor whispered the name aloud as if testing a ghost. Back then, Jack wasn't just an employee. He was a friend, the kind who stayed late when others clocked out, who helped fix engines and build dreams. Until the accident, a crane collapse on Site 14, a faulty cable. 2 men injured, one permanently. The company was young then. Insurance was thin, lawyers were ruthless. Victor remembered the arguments, the signatures, the settlement he was told to approve to protect the company's future. Jack had been furious, felt abandoned. He'd written a letter then, too, ending with the same words. You walked away. Victor closed his eyes. The realization hit with slow, deliberate cruelty. The man who had carried his son up that mountain was the same man he'd once left broken at the bottom of his own. He stood abruptly, pushing the chair back. The city lights outside blurred, his reflection ghostly in the glass. He didn't know what he was chasing anymore. Forgiveness, maybe. Redemption, maybe not. But he needed to find him. He took the letter to a private investigator he trusted, someone who had handled delicate matters before. I don't want headlines, Victor said. Just answers. Days passed. The investigator dug through public records, bank accounts, security cameras. Jack's cabin remained empty, his truck untouched. No digital trail, but one detail stood out. A withdrawal from a local bank 2 days before he vanished. The amount was small, barely enough for gas and food, and a name appeared on the transaction. Clara Hale. Victor froze. His late wife's name? He felt the air leave his lungs. Clara had been gone for 16 years, taken by a sudden illness before Ethan could even walk. What connection could she possibly have to Jack? He drove home that night without turning on the radio. The silence felt sacred, like he might disturb something if he filled it. When he arrived, Ethan was asleep, the glow from the city casting faint shapes on the boy's face. Victor watched him, his chest tightening with a strange mixture of pride and regret. He whispered to the sleeping boy, I'm trying, son. I really am. The next morning, he searched through old photo boxes in the attic, dusty corners of his life he hadn't touched in years. He found construction photos from the early Hale Industries days. There was Jack, younger, leaner, eyes bright. And beside him, Clara. They weren't just acquaintances. The way she looked at him, laughing, her hand brushing his arm, there was a familiarity there, a warmth that didn't belong to coworkers. Victor's pulse quickened. He flipped through more photos. Clara with Victor smiling stiffly at company events. Clara with Jack smiling effortlessly when she thought no one was watching. And suddenly the letter's message took on a new meaning. You don't remember me, Victor, but I remember the day you walked away. Had he been talking about the accident? Or about her? A sharp knock pulled him out of his spiral. Ethan was at the door holding his tablet. Dad, you have to see this, he said. On the screen was a new viral post, another video from the mountain, this time captured from a different angle. It showed Jack and Ethan near the summit, the camera shakier, closer. In the background, faintly visible, was a second figure, a woman watching from a distance wearing a long blue coat. Ethan smiled. That's the nurse who helped me get ready that morning. She said she knew Jack from way back. Victor's heart pounded. Do you remember her name? Ethan thought for a moment. She said her name was Grace, a common name. But it tugged at a distant memory. Clara's middle name. He tried to speak, but the words came out brittle. Did she say where she lived? Ethan shook his head. No, but she said something weird. Said Jack wasn't supposed to climb that mountain again. Said it wasn't safe for him. Again. Victor felt the ground shift beneath the weight of that word. The next morning he drove to the trailhead again, this time without the limousine or the bodyguards. The woods greeted him with the same silence as before, but it felt heavier now, like the trees themselves were holding secrets. He hiked partway up the path, ignoring the burn in his legs. Each step seemed to echo with questions. He found the clearing where Jack had paused during the climb, the same one from the drone footage. The dirt still bore faint indentations from boots and wheels. As he stood there, a hiker passed by, an older woman with a shepherd dog. She slowed when she saw him. You're the father, aren't you? She asked softly. Victor nodded. I saw them that day, she said. The boy and the man. He wasn't supposed to be carrying anyone, you know. I heard his back was bad, but he said some debts weigh more than pain. Victor felt a chill. Did he say where he was going afterward? The woman thought for a moment. He mentioned a cabin by the lake. said it was where everything started. When she left, Victor stood for a long time, watching the sunlight flicker through the branches. Then he turned and started walking toward the lake. The road narrowed into gravel, then into dirt. The lake emerged through the trees, still and mirror-like. At its edge stood a half-collapsed boathouse. Victor approached cautiously, his shoes crunching on the damp ground. Inside, the air smelled of rot and rain-soaked wood. A small fire pit sat near the wall. Beside it, a box of letters, dozens of them, all addressed to Clara Hale. Victor knelt, his hands trembling as he opened one. The handwriting was Jack's. I didn't mean to love her. But she saw me when I was invisible. When the company fell apart, she kept saying you'd make it right. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to hate you. But then she got sick, and all that anger didn't matter anymore. Another letter dated years later. I saw your boy once. He's got her eyes. I guess that's why I couldn't say no when he asked me to take him up the trail. It wasn't just his dream, Victor. It was hers too. The letters blurred as Victor's vision filled with tears. He understood now. The mountain wasn't a random act of kindness. It was a promise fulfilled long after death. He picked up one last envelope, newer, cleaner, written after the climb. If you're reading this, I've already gone. I couldn't face you again, not after what I did and what I felt. I just wanted the boy to see what his mother once dreamed of. The summit, the sky, the world beyond all the noise. At the bottom, a final line. Don't look for me. Just carry him where I couldn't anymore. Victor sat in silence, the letters spread around him like fallen leaves. Outside, the wind moved across the lake, gentle, unhurried. He thought of Clara's laughter, of Jack's steady hands lifting Ethan up that trail, of promises kept and broken, of the strange, twisted grace that bound them all. When he finally stood, he looked out at the lake, at the reflection of the mountains rippling in the water, and whispered, I remember you now. As he turned to leave, something caught his eye, a small wooden cross half buried near the boathouse. It was carved roughly, the name almost faded, Clara, and beside it, freshly etched into the damp soil, another, Jack. The realization hit him like thunder rolling through still air. He wasn't missing. He was here. The wind swept through the trees, bending them low, whispering like voices half remembered. Victor fell to his knees, his hand pressing against the cool earth between the two names. Above him, the clouds parted for a moment, spilling sunlight across the lake, a fragile, fleeting grace. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, Victor Hale wept, not as a billionaire, not as a man with power, but as a father, a husband, and a soul finally brought face to face with everything he had left behind. When he rose, something in his posture had changed. The weight that had once been pride now looked like purpose. He walked back toward the trail, slowly, deliberately. In the distance, the mountain loomed, patient, unmoved, eternal, and Victor knew what he had to do next. He would climb it again, but this time, he wouldn't climb it to find forgiveness. He would climb it to carry his son. The sun began to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the earth. And somewhere between the rustling leaves and the whispering wind, it almost sounded like a voice, faint, familiar, saying, Keep going, Victor. You're almost there. The wind was colder on the mountain this time, sharper, thinner, the kind that pressed against the skin like a quiet warning. Victor felt it bite through his jacket as he adjusted the straps of the harness across his chest. The wheelchair rig had been custom built by his engineering team. Carbon fiber frame, reinforced handles, mechanical assistance on the incline. The kind of innovation money could buy, but as he stood at the base of the trail with Ethan looking up at the endless rise of stone and pine, he understood that what lay ahead couldn't be conquered by design. Are you sure you want to do this, Dad? Ethan's voice was steady but uncertain, a thin tremor beneath his usual courage. Victor smiled faintly. I've never been more sure of anything. A few hikers watched them curiously. A man in a dark jacket, a boy with a fragile frame, strange contraptions glinting in the morning light. They didn't know the story. To them, it was just another father and son at the start of a trail, but to Victor, it was a pilgrimage. The climb began slowly. Each turn of the wheels was deliberate, each step a conversation between muscle and memory. The forest around them came alive with the sounds he'd never truly heard before. Birds calling from the canopy, the crack of branches, the hush of wind brushing over rock. He felt the earth again, not as something beneath him, but as something surrounding him, inviting him. Ethan laughed softly as they moved higher. Jack said this part was the hardest. Victor nodded, pushing through the incline. Then that's where we'll start proving him wrong. For a while it was just the two of them, father and son, breath and rhythm. But as the trail steepened, something began to shift inside Victor. He'd imagined this climb would bring peace, redemption maybe. But with every step the silence grew heavier. It wasn't forgiveness that waited at the top. It was truth. Halfway up they stopped to rest at a ridge overlooking the valley. The sky stretched endlessly, washed in gold and silver. Ethan stared out, eyes wide. "Mom used to love places like this," he said softly. Victor froze. He hadn't expected her name to echo here. "She did," he whispered. "She used to tell me stories," Ethan continued, "about a lake where she and her friend used to go after work. She said it was their secret place." Victor's pulse slowed. "She told you that?" Ethan nodded, tracing patterns in the dirt. "She said they made a promise and that one day when they both had kids they'd bring them there together." The air seemed to shift around them, as if the mountain itself were listening. Victor looked toward the horizon where the lake lay hidden beyond the trees. He thought of the two wooden crosses, the letters, the quiet ache in Jack's words. A promise. It wasn't just love or guilt that had bound Jack and Clara. It was something older, purer. A dream unfulfilled. He tried to speak, but his throat tightened. "Ethan, what else did she say about him?" The boy thought for a moment. She never said his name, just that he helped her believe in things again. She said he reminded her what it meant to start over. Victor turned away, his gaze falling on the shadowed tree line. The wind rose again, carrying whispers that felt like memories half remembered. They continued climbing, the path narrowing into uneven stone. The air grew thinner, colder. Every few steps Victor's legs trembled, his breath coming harder. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. Near the final stretch, the trail split into two narrow paths, one steep and rocky, the other longer but smoother. Ethan pointed toward the steeper one. "That's where Jack went," he said. Victor studied the incline, jagged rocks, loose gravel, dangerous footing. "How do you know?" "Because that's what he told me," Ethan said. "He said sometimes the hard path is the one that gets you there faster, if you're willing to fall." Victor's grip tightened on the handles. "We'll take it." The climb became a battle, against gravity, exhaustion, memory. Sweat dripped from Victor's forehead, stinging his eyes. The wheels caught on stones, the harness strained. The sound of his own breath filled the world. But each time he faltered, he heard Jack's voice in his mind. "Keep going, Victor. You're almost there." And for a moment he thought he actually heard it, not in his head, but in the air. He froze, glancing around. The forest was still, but somewhere up the path faintly came the sound of a man's footsteps. He pushed harder, heart pounding, half driven by hope, half by something close to fear. The trees thinned, revealing the clearing, the summit where the drone had captured the viral video. The same view, the same stretch of sky, but this time someone was already there. At the edge of the cliff stood a man, broad-shouldered, wearing a faded jacket, hands in his pockets. For a second, Victor thought it was an illusion. Then the man turned and the light caught his face. It was Jack, older, thinner, but unmistakably him. Victor's breath caught. He looked at Ethan. The boy was frozen, wide-eyed. Jack smiled faintly. "Didn't think you'd actually do it," he said, voice soft, calm, as if they'd been meeting here every weekend. Victor took a step forward, disbelief flooding him. "You're alive," Jack shrugged. "Depends what you mean by that." He looked at Ethan, his expression gentle. "You made it, kid. Told you he would." Ethan's voice broke. You said you were gone." Jack's smile faltered, eyes glancing toward Victor. "Sometimes leaving is the only way to finish what you started." Victor's hands trembled. "You faked your death." Jack said nothing for a moment. Then quietly, "I needed you to climb. Not for me. For him." He nodded toward Ethan. "If I'd stayed, you'd still be down there building walls out of guilt." The wind pressed through the clearing, the sky darkening slightly as clouds gathered overhead. Victor stepped closer. You should have told me. About her. About everything. Jack's eyes met his, tired but clear. Would you have listened? There was no accusation in his tone, only truth. And that truth hit harder than anger ever could. Victor looked away, his jaw tight. You loved her. Jack nodded slowly. Yeah, but not the way you think. Clara was light. She healed people. You built worlds. I think part of her always belonged to both of us. Silence hung between them, fragile and heavy. Ethan watched, not understanding all the words but feeling their weight. Jack turned toward the horizon, his gaze distant. She made me promise something before she died. Said if you ever forgot what mattered, I was to remind you, no matter what it cost. Victor's voice was barely a whisper. And this was the reminder? Jack smiled faintly. Sometimes the only way to bring a man back to life is to let him lose everything that kept him numb. A rumble of thunder rolled across the mountain. Ethan's hand gripped his father's arm. Dad. Victor looked at him. At the fear, the awe, the innocence that didn't yet understand the full history written in the air. He turned back to Jack, but the man was stepping toward the edge of the cliff. Jack. Jack stopped, half in shadow, half in sunlight. You've got your second chance now. Don't waste it like we did. Victor's breath caught. Wait, what are you doing? Jack looked back, a sad kind of peace in his eyes. Finishing the climb. And before Victor could move, Jack stepped forward, not falling but walking into the mist that had begun to rise off the cliffside. One moment he was there, solid and real. The next he was gone, swallowed by the fog. Ethan cried out, reaching forward, but Victor held him close. Frozen between disbelief and something larger, awe, grief, understanding. The fog thinned slowly, revealing the vast valley below. But Jack was nowhere. No trace, no sound, just the echo of his last words hanging in the wind. Victor sank to his knees, his chest heaving. Ethan whispered, Dad, was he real? Victor stared at the empty space where Jack had been. The air still carried warmth faintly, the kind that shouldn't linger on a cold mountain. I don't know, he said quietly, but I think he's been real all along. A single ray of sunlight broke through the clouds, touching the summit. The wind softened. Victor closed his eyes, feeling it on his face, the way Jack must have felt it when he carried Ethan up here the first time. He didn't know if he'd seen a man or a memory, but he knew what he had to do next. He turned to Ethan, voice steady. We're not done yet, Ethan frowned. What do you mean? Victor looked toward the horizon, toward the lake shimmering faintly in the distance beneath the clouds. We're going back down, he said. There's something we need to find. And for the first time since the climb began, his voice didn't sound burdened. It sounded certain. As they began their descent, the mountain behind them rumbled softly, and not like thunder, but like an exhale. A release. And somewhere below, far beyond the mist, something waited. Something that would change everything Victor thought he knew about his wife, his friend, and the promise that had started it all. The descent felt different. Not easier, never easier, but quieter, more deliberate, as if the mountain itself were watching. The fog clung to the trees, turning each step into something dreamlike. Ethan's voice was soft behind him, half a whisper. Do you think he's gone, Dad? Victor didn't answer right away. He could still feel Jack's presence in the wind, hear the echo of his last words. I don't think people like him ever really go, he said finally. They just change where they stand. By the time they reached the base of the trail, the sun was falling low, bleeding orange light across the valley. The world felt charged, as if everything around them had shifted slightly out of alignment. Victor lifted Ethan from the harness and set him gently in his chair. His arms trembled, not just from exertion, but from something deeper. He looked back up the mountain, then toward the lake beyond. We're going there, he said. Now. Ethan nodded without question. They drove along the winding road that followed the curve of the woods, the car's tires whispering against the dirt. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was heavy, thick with things unsaid. When the trees parted, the lake came into view again, still and black under the dying light. But this time, something was different. The boathouse, the one that had been abandoned and half collapsed, now had a light flickering inside, faint but unmistakable. Victor stopped the car. His pulse quickened. Stay here, he told Ethan, his voice lower now, almost instinctively protective. He stepped out into the cold evening air. The smell of wet pine and smoke lingered. Each step toward the boathouse echoed off the water. The light wasn't from a lamp or flashlight, it flickered like fire. When he reached the door, he hesitated, then pushed it open. The inside was just as he remembered, wooden beams sagging, letters scattered on the floor. But now, near the center, a small fire burned in an old oil drum, and next to it sat a woman. Her hair was streaked with gray, her coat old and worn. But her face stopped him cold. "Grace," he said, breath catching. She looked up slowly, her eyes meeting his. "You shouldn't have come back." Victor took a step forward, stunned. "You were with Ethan that day on the mountain? You disappeared right after." She smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I had to make sure Jack got there safely." The fire crackled between them, throwing light across the cabin walls. "Where is he?" Victor asked. "What did you do?" Grace stared into the flames. "What he did, you mean? He wasn't supposed to go back up there. His heart couldn't take it. But when Ethan asked, he couldn't say no." Victor's chest tightened. "He's dead, isn't he?" Grace nodded once, almost imperceptibly. "He went up that mountain to finish something he started years ago. And to remind you of something you forgot." Victor looked around. At the letters, the faint marks in the dust, the ghost of a life that had existed here. "He said Clara made him promise to bring me back." "But what does that mean?" "Bring me back to what?" Grace's expression softened. "To yourself," he shook his head. "That's not enough. There's more to this, I can feel it." She studied him for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "There's something you never knew about that day she died." Victor froze. "What are you talking about?" Grace hesitated, the flames flickering across her face. "Clara wasn't alone when she collapsed. Jack was with her." The words landed like a physical blow. He stepped closer, his voice low. "He told me he left town before that." Grace's eyes glistened. "He tried. But she called him that morning. Said she was scared. Said she felt weak. He came back to help her. He carried her to the car, tried to get her to the hospital. She died before they made it halfway." Victor's throat tightened, his world tilting. "And he never told me?" "He tried," Grace said. "You wouldn't have believed him." "You needed someone to blame. And he already carried enough guilt for the accident. He thought silence would hurt less." Victor's knees weakened, his breath shallow. Images flashed. Clara laughing, Jack's weary smile, the endless years of distance he'd built from both of them. He'd blamed the wrong man. Grace watched him, her voice gentle but unwavering. "You built an empire out of that guilt, Victor. But you built it on sand." He sank onto the old bench beside the fire, his hands covering his face. "All these years, I thought he took everything from me." Grace shook her head. "No, he gave you back what you lost, and your son, your purpose. Even your grief." The fire crackled, and for a moment the silence between them felt like mercy. Then Victor looked up, eyes wet. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because he wanted you to know the truth," she said. "And because there's one more thing he left for you." She reached into her coat and pulled out a small, weathered envelope. On the front, written in the same handwriting as before, were 2 words. "For Ethan." Victor took it, his fingers trembling. "What's inside?" Grace smiled faintly. "A story. One he wanted the boy to hear from you." He looked down at the envelope, the edges soft from being carried too long. When he looked back up, Grace was standing. "Where will you go?" he asked. She paused at the door, looking out toward the lake. Back to where it all started. Maybe it's time to stop being someone's ghost. Then she was gone, her figure dissolving into the fog. Victor sat alone, staring at the envelope as the fire slowly died. The air grew colder, but he didn't move. His mind was a storm. Memories, questions, the slow unraveling of a story he'd thought he already knew. Finally, he rose and walked out to the car. Ethan was awake, watching him through the window. "Did you find something?" the boy asked. Victor slid into the driver's seat, his expression unreadable. "Yes," he said softly. "Something that belongs to you." He handed Ethan the envelope. The boy turned it over, tracing the letters on the front. "Who's it from?" Victor's gaze lingered on the horizon. "A friend of your mother's. Someone who loved you very much." Ethan looked confused but curious. He opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a folded piece of paper and a small photograph of Clara. holding a baby in her arms, standing beside a younger Jack. Ethan stared. "Dad, who took this?" Victor didn't answer. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. On the back of the photograph were 4 words written in faded ink. "He's more than you know." The car was silent except for the ticking of the cooling engine. Ethan turned to his father, his voice barely above a whisper. "Dad, what does it mean?" Victor's eyes were fixed on the photo, on Jack's hand resting gently on Clara's shoulder, on the way she looked at him, on the baby's soft, unknowing face, his own face. The world seemed to narrow, the night pressing close around them. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow, almost distant. "It means the mountain wasn't the only truth he carried." Outside, the fog thickened over the lake, swallowing the last traces of light. And inside the car, father and son sat in the dark, holding a photograph that had just rewritten both of their lives. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The world outside the car had gone still, not silent, but holding its breath the way the earth does before a storm. The lake stretched out under a thin veil of mist, its surface perfectly calm, a mirror refusing to reveal what lay beneath. Inside, the photograph trembled between Ethan's fingers. He looked from it to his father, then back again, his young face caught between confusion and dawning understanding. "Dad." His voice broke the air like a thread snapping. "Is that Victor couldn't look at him?" His eyes were locked on the image. Clara smiling in the sunlight, her hair pulled back, her arms wrapped around a baby, the baby's eyes bright and unknowing. And beside her, Jack. His hand rested gently on the child's shoulder, protective, proud. It was a photograph of a family, but not the one Victor thought he had. The weight of it pressed down on his chest, deep and suffocating. The air felt thinner, colder. "I don't understand," Ethan whispered. "Why would he have a picture like this?" Victor swallowed hard. His voice came out rough, almost foreign to his own ears. "Because Ethan, I think that's the day you were born." Ethan frowned, shaking his head. "That can't be right." "You were there. You told me—" "I told you what I thought was true," Victor said, his words trembling. "What I needed to believe." He took the photograph gently from Ethan's hands and stared at it, tracing the faded outlines of Clara's face. Her eyes were soft, unguarded, not the rehearsed smiles from their corporate photo shoots, not the polite grace of the woman who learned how to live beside ambition. This was her real self, the version she'd hidden from him long before she was gone. The truth crept into his mind slowly, cruelly. Jack's letters, his silence, the way Clara's illness had always been a mystery wrapped in distance, the timing, the looks she used to give when Victor spoke of building legacies and futures. He whispered more to himself than to Ethan. "He wasn't just carrying my son up that mountain." He closed his eyes. He was carrying his own. The words hung there. Neither of them dared breathe. Ethan stared at him, eyes wide, trembling. "You're saying—" "I don't know," Victor said quickly. "Not for sure. But this—" He held up the photograph. "This changes everything." The boy's gaze fell to the image again. His hands shook. "All this time. All those stories. He knew me. He really knew me." Victor reached out instinctively, but Ethan pulled back, his voice sharp. "Did you know, Dad? Did you ever wonder?" Victor flinched. The honesty in the question cut deeper than any accusation. "No," he said, the word catching in his throat. "I didn't, and that's the worst part. I never wondered. I was too busy trying to be right." The air inside the car grew heavy. Ethan turned toward the window, his reflection ghostly in the glass. "So what am I supposed to be now? Yours? His? Hers? None of it makes sense." Victor's hand rested on the steering wheel, knuckles white. "You're my son," he said quietly, firmly. "That's what matters." Ethan's reply came as barely a whisper. "And his blood?" Victor didn't answer. He couldn't. Because the truth, whatever shape it took, had already changed everything. Outside, thunder rolled far off in the distance. The storm was moving in. The trees along the shoreline began to sway, their branches bending under the wind's gathering strength. Victor started the engine. "We're leaving," he said. "Where?" "To find out." They drove in silence through the winding back roads, headlights cutting through the thickening mist. Rain began to fall in slow, deliberate drops that smeared across the windshield. The storm followed them, growing heavier with every mile. They reached a hospital in the next town just before night fully swallowed the sky. Victor walked in with the photograph clutched in his hand like evidence of a crime. The receptionist recognized him instantly, everyone always did, and ushered him into a private office. He laid the photo down on the desk. "I need information," he said. "Birth records. 16 years ago. Clara Hale." The clerk hesitated, glancing at the photo. "Sir, those records are sealed. Unseal them." His voice was sharp, colder than he intended. "Now." The woman nodded nervously and disappeared down a corridor. Ethan sat beside him, silent, pale. The rain drummed harder against the windows, a low, relentless rhythm. When the woman returned, she carried a thin folder. "This is all we have," she said softly. Victor opened it. Inside were only 2 documents, the birth record and a discharge note. His eyes scanned the pages until they stopped on one line that changed everything. Father's name, unknown. He stared at it, unblinking. The room seemed to tilt. His hands shook as he turned the page. The second document was handwritten, a note signed by Clara left for the attending physician. "If anything happens, please make sure he carries both our names." The signature was hers. And below it, faintly, another set of initials, J.M. Jack Moore. Victor sat back in the chair, the air leaving his lungs in one long, shuddering breath. His mind was a storm of fragments. Her laughter, Jack's quiet strength, Ethan's smile, all merging into a single, unbearable truth. Ethan reached for the folder, his eyes scanning the same lines. He froze when he saw the initials. His voice was small, almost childlike. "So it's true." Victor couldn't meet his gaze. "It means he loved you, Ethan, that's all it means." The boy stood, his chair creaking. "It means I'm not who I thought I was." Victor looked up, eyes wet. "You're exactly who you're supposed to be." Ethan's expression hardened. "You spent my whole life telling me I could do anything if I worked hard enough. But what happens when the person you're working to become isn't even yours?" The question cracked something inside Victor. He rose slowly, his voice quiet but urgent. "Blood doesn't make family, son. Love does. The man who raised you is the man you belong to." Ethan shook his head. "Then maybe I belong to both of you." The storm outside intensified, lightning flashing through the windows. For a moment, it lit up the room in a stark silver glow, and Victor saw his son's face, half in shadow, half illuminated. He saw Clara in him, he saw Jack, and he saw himself, not in the features, but in the ache. He realized then that the mountain had never been about forgiveness. It was about inheritance, not of money or power, but of pain, love, and unfinished promises. Ethan turned toward the door. "I need air." "Ethan." But the boy was already gone. Victor ran after him, bursting through the hospital doors into the rain. The parking lot was empty except for their car, headlights still glowing dimly through the storm. "Ethan," he called out. His voice vanished into the wind. Then he saw him standing at the edge of the lot, facing the road, the photograph in his hand. The rain soaked through his hair, plastering it to his forehead. Victor approached slowly, his voice breaking. "Please listen to me." Ethan didn't turn. "He carried me up that mountain because he wanted me to see something beautiful. You carried me down because you wanted to fix what was broken. Maybe that's the difference between you and him." Victor stopped a few feet away. "And what do you want, Ethan?" Ethan's shoulders shook. "To know where I come from." Victor looked toward the dark road stretching beyond the lot. Somewhere out there lay Jack's grave by the lake, the letters, the unfinished story. Somewhere out there was the truth. "Then we'll go together," he said quietly. Ethan turned, his face streaked with rain and tears. For the first time that night, something softened in his eyes. "Together?" Victor nodded. "No more ghosts. No more lies." The boy hesitated, then slowly reached out. Victor took his hand. The rain fell harder, washing the last of the photograph's ink until the faces blurred into one, no longer 3 people, but one tangled memory of love and loss. They stood there until the storm began to fade, the thunder rolling into the distance. When they finally got into the car, the headlights cut through the thinning rain. The road ahead glistened like silver. As they drove toward the lake, Victor glanced at his son, no matter what the blood said. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man haunted by the past. He felt like someone heading toward the truth, whatever it would cost. The wipers beat in slow rhythm, keeping time with the hum of the engine. The night stretched out before them, endless. Waiting, and in the soft murmur of the storm's retreat, Victor thought he heard it again. That voice, faint but clear, carried on the wind. "Keep going, Victor. You're almost there." Dawn was just beginning to break when the lake came into view again. The storm had passed hours ago, leaving behind a world washed clean, trees glistening with dew, air sharp and still, the water so smooth it seemed afraid to breathe. The car rolled to a stop at the trailhead, the same one where it had all begun, the same one where everything had changed. Victor turned off the engine, and for a long time neither he nor Ethan moved. The silence between them wasn't empty now. It was heavy but peaceful, filled with the kind of quiet that only comes after the breaking of something vast. Ethan was the first to speak. "It looks different," he said softly. Victor looked out over the landscape, the faint morning mist curling across the ground. "Maybe we do too." They stepped out into the cold air, shoes crunching against wet gravel. The smell of rain and pine filled their lungs. Victor glanced up at the mountain trail ahead, its path twisting upward through the trees like a scar carved by time. "Are we going up again?" Ethan asked, his voice unsure. Victor hesitated, then shook his head. "No, not this time." He walked toward the edge of the lake instead, where the earth sloped down to a narrow bank of stones. The water was clear, the surface reflecting the pale blush of morning light. He reached into his jacket and took out the photograph, the one that had survived the storm. Its ink now faint and blurred, the faces barely visible. Ethan joined him, peering over his shoulder. "They look happy," he said. Victor smiled faintly. They were, even if it was just for a moment. The boy studied his father's face. "Do you think she loved both of you?" Victor didn't answer right away. His gaze stayed fixed on the photo. "I think love isn't something you measure," he said finally. "It's something you leave behind in the people you've touched." He looked at Ethan. "That's what your mother did. And that's what Jack did too." The boy nodded slowly, his eyes tracing the ripples on the lake. "He carried me because he loved her. And I carried you because I loved both of you," Victor said quietly. The wind moved gently across the surface of the water, stirring faint waves. A pair of birds skimmed low over the lake, wings slicing through the air in perfect synchrony. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan crouched down and picked up a small stone, running his thumb along its smooth edge. "What do we do with it?" he asked, nodding toward the photograph. Victor looked at it one last time, at the faint outlines of Clara's smile, Jack's arm, the ghost of the child between them. "We give it back," he said. He held the photo over the water, fingers trembling slightly. Ethan reached up and placed his hand over his father's, steadying it. Together, they let it go. The paper fluttered once, then drifted down onto the lake's surface, where it floated for a few seconds before the water slowly pulled it under. The ripples spread outward, fading until the lake was still again. Victor exhaled, a sound halfway between release and relief. "He's gone now," he said softly. "All of them are." Ethan looked at him. "Not all," he said. Victor turned and saw the boy's faint smile. Something inside him loosened, the guilt, the anger, the endless ache of years lost. He hadn't realized until now that love could outlast even truth. That forgiveness wasn't about changing what happened, but learning to live with the echoes. They stood there for a while longer, watching the sunrise paint the lake in bands of gold and silver. Ethan spoke again, his voice small but certain. "You think we'll ever climb it again? The mountain?" Victor glanced up at the trail, the path twisting out of sight beyond the trees. "Maybe one day," he said. "But next time we won't be chasing ghosts." Ethan smiled. "Then what will we be chasing?" Victor's eyes softened. "Something real." The boy nodded, seeming to understand in a way that went beyond words. He wheeled himself closer to the water's edge, letting the morning breeze brush across his face. Victor watched him, realizing how much strength there was in the way his son carried his silence. The same quiet strength Jack had carried. And Clara, too. He thought back to that first day on the mountain, the fog, the strangers, the climb. The man he'd met was not a rival, not even a savior. He was the bridge between what had been broken and what could still be mended. Jack had carried Ethan, but in the end he'd also carried Victor. back to the truth, back to himself. Victor walked to where Ethan sat and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Let's go home," he said. Ethan looked up. "Where's that?" Victor smiled, his voice steady. "Wherever we start again." They turned back toward the car, the path glistening with morning dew. Behind them, the lake shimmered, reflecting the first full light of day. The photograph was gone now, swallowed by the water. But its meaning lingered, not in the image itself, but in what it had set free. As they walked, Victor found himself thinking of Clara again, her laughter echoing through the kitchen, the way she'd hum when she thought no one was listening, and he thought of Jack, the man who'd carried his son up a mountain not to prove anything, but to give him a view of the world worth believing in. He wondered if somewhere, somehow, they were both watching. If they could see how far forgiveness could travel once it began moving downhill, gathering everything it touched. When they reached the car, Victor opened the door for Ethan and then paused, looking back one last time at the mountain. It loomed quietly in the distance, its peaks now glowing with sunlight, every stone and shadow softened by morning. He whispered under his breath, "Thank you." Ethan turned. "For what?" "For carrying what I couldn't," Victor said. The boy didn't ask who he meant. Maybe because, in a way, it didn't matter. They drove away slowly, the tires crunching over gravel, the world opening up ahead. The road wound between the trees through streaks of sunlight and shadow. The air smelled of rain and beginnings. Inside the car, neither of them spoke for a while. The silence wasn't heavy now. It was calm, alive, filled with something almost like hope. Ethan rested his head against the window, watching the forest blur past. "Dad," he said softly, "yeah? Do you think people ever really leave?" Victor thought about it, about Clara's laughter still ringing in his memory, about Jack's voice carried in the wind that morning, about the way love seemed to survive every distance. He smiled. "No," he said. "I think they just change the way they stay." Ethan's eyes drifted closed, a faint smile on his face. Victor looked back at the road, his reflection faint in the windshield. Older now, humbled but lighter than he'd been in years. Outside, the mountain grew smaller in the rearview mirror, until it disappeared behind the curve of the road. But its presence stayed, might not as a burden this time, but as a quiet promise. And somewhere in that thin space between memory and sky, the voices of the past seemed to blend with the sound of the wind, whispering not of loss but of return, because in the end, the man who carried the boy had carried more than flesh and bone. He had carried a legacy of love, one that would outlive names, truth, and blood. The lake would forget their footsteps. The mountain would keep their secret. But somewhere deep inside the silence, the echo of what they'd all left behind would remain. The proof that the hardest climbs are never about reaching the top. They're about finding the courage to start again. The car disappeared down the road, sunlight spilling across the wet pavement, the morning wide open ahead of them. And in the distance, the mountain stood watching, timeless, patient, waiting for the next soul brave enough to carry their heart to its summit, and brave enough to forgive what they found there.